Somewhere over the Persian Gulf, a ballistic missile is in the air. It was launched from the back of a truck, somewhere in a country 3 times the size of France. The Americans tried to jam its GPS signal. The Israelis tried to spoof its navigation, but this missile does not care, because it is not listening to American satellites anymore. It is locked onto something else entirely, something Beijing built, something Washington never planned for. And when it hit its target with less than 1 meter of error, every military analyst in the CIA, every defense contractor in Washington, and every admiral aboard a U.S. carrier in the Persian Gulf went completely silent, because the intelligence assessments were wrong, catastrophically wrong. And what that means for you, for the global economy, for every barrel of oil that moves through one of the most critical waterways on the planet. That is what this video is about. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will understand why the world just changed and why nobody in the mainstream media is telling you the full story. To understand how we got here, you need to go back not to February 28th, 2026, the day the bombs started falling, but much further back. You need to understand a decision that Iran made quietly, almost invisibly, in 2015. A decision that most Western intelligence agencies dismissed as irrelevant. A decision that just rewrote the rules of modern warfare. In 2015, Iran signed a memorandum of understanding with China. On the surface, it looked like a routine diplomatic agreement, a technology partnership, the kind of thing that gets buried on page 12 of a foreign policy briefing. What it actually was, according to researchers at the China Med Project, was Iran's first formal step toward integrating China's BeiDou navigation satellite system directly into its military infrastructure, specifically into its missile guidance architecture. At the time, Western analysts shrugged. China's satellite system wasn't fully operational yet. Iran's missiles were already considered a regional threat. Why would this matter? The answer to that question is now exploding, literally, across the skies of Israel, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. But before we get to what BeiDou actually does and why it is so terrifying for the US military, you need to understand the world it was born into. Because nothing about this crisis happened in isolation. This is a story that builds layer by layer like pressure beneath the earth. And what we are watching right now is the eruption. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise military strike against Iran. They hit nuclear facilities, they hit ballistic missile programs, they targeted the Iranian leadership directly. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Multiple senior IRGC commanders were eliminated. Iran's defense minister was gone. Its intelligence leadership was decimated. In Washington, there was a feeling, carefully managed, officially cautious, but present, that Iran had been dealt a blow from which it could not recover quickly, that the country's command structure was shattered, that its military would be disorganized, degraded, confused. That assessment lasted approximately 72 hours. Because what happened next was not what the CIA predicted. It was not what the Pentagon wargamed. And it was not what the analysts in Tel Aviv had modeled. Iran began firing back, not randomly, not desperately, with precision. Here's where the story gets genuinely extraordinary. And this is the part that every major Western outlet has mentioned, but almost none have fully explained. Iranian missile strikes in this conflict are hitting their targets with a level of accuracy that has shocked military analysts. Not just slightly better than before, dramatically better. Former French Foreign Intelligence Director Alain Juillet, speaking on an independent intelligence podcast, put it plainly. He said that One of the genuine surprises of this war is that Iranian missiles are far more accurate than they were just 8 months ago, during the 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel in June 2025. And he said the most realistic explanation, the one that actually fits the operational data, is that Iran has transitioned to China's BeiDou navigation system. Now you might be asking, what is the difference? Isn't GPS just GPS? One satellite signal is the same as another, right? This is exactly the misunderstanding that cost Western planners so dearly. Let me walk you through why BeiDou is not just an alternative to GPS. In this particular military context, against these particular adversaries, it is actually superior. The United States controls GPS. That sounds like a technical fact, but it is a profoundly strategic one. The US military has the ability to degrade, restrict, or outright jam GPS signals in contested areas. During the 12-day war in June 2025, that is precisely what happened. Israeli and American electronic warfare systems flooded Iranian airspace with interference. Iranian drones, which were navigating on civilian GPS signals, started going off course. Missiles lost accuracy. The results of that campaign reflected that technological gap. Iran fired, but the precision wasn't there. The jamming worked. So Iran, watching its weapons get neutralized by satellite signal manipulation, made a decision. And that decision was completed on June 23, 2025. On that date, Iran formally deactivated GPS reception nationwide for both military and civilian use. The entire country switched. Transportation, logistics, agriculture, navigation, all of it moved to BeiDou. It was an enormous, historically significant technological declaration, and most of the world's media covered it as a footnote. What Iran gained in that transition is staggering when you understand the technical details. BeiDou operates more than 50 satellites, compared to roughly 24 in the GPS network. More satellites means stronger signal geometry. It means better coverage, higher redundancy, and critically, greater accuracy at the latitudes where the Middle East sits. The open civilian signal from BeiDou already gives positioning accuracy of around 5 to 10 meters. But the restricted military tier signal, the B3A signal, is a different animal entirely. Military analyst Patricia Marins described it directly. She said, BDS-3's military tier signal is essentially unjammable. It uses complex frequency hopping and navigation message authentication, which prevents spoofing entirely. The margin of error is less than 1 meter. Under optimal conditions, it reaches centimeter-level precision. Think about what that means in practice. Think about what it means when you have a ballistic missile traveling at hypersonic speed toward a target hundreds of kilometers away. With the old GPS-based system, a jammer could push that missile off course by sending fake coordinates. The missile would think it was somewhere it wasn't. With BeiDou's military signal, that trick doesn't work. The signal can't be spoofed. The authentication protocol catches the fake coordinates and rejects them. The missile stays on course, and it hits within 1 meter of its intended target. But here is the part that should keep every naval strategist awake at night. BeiDou does something GPS does not do. It includes a short message communication function. This is not a minor feature. This capability allows operators on the ground to communicate with a drone or missile while it is in flight at ranges up to 2,000 kilometers. Which means Iranian forces can potentially redirect a weapon after it has already been launched. They can adjust the target mid-flight. They can respond to a moving target, a ship, a vehicle, an aircraft, and correct the weapon's trajectory in real time. This is not theoretical. This is the system that Iran completed integrating into its military architecture in mid-2025. And this is the system that is now guiding weapons across the skies of the Middle East. Now, while all of this satellite and guidance technology is extraordinary, and we are going to come back to its strategic implications in a moment, you need to understand the broader battlefield picture it is creating. Because the missiles aren't just hitting Iran's traditional adversaries, they are landing in places the global economy absolutely cannot afford to have disrupted. And this is where the story shifts from being about military technology to being about your economy, about oil prices, about the cost of everything you buy. Iran, recognizing that it cannot match the US and Israeli Air Forces plane for plane, has pursued a different strategy entirely. It has weaponized geography. Specifically, it has weaponized the Strait of Hormuz. And what is happening in that waterway right now is the most consequential economic event since the COVID supply chain collapse. And it is barely being discussed in those terms. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water, less than 33 miles wide at its narrowest point, between Iran and Oman. Through that channel moves approximately 20% of the world's oil supply every day. The number is almost incomprehensible. Saudi Arabian crude, Kuwaiti oil, Qatari liquefied natural gas, Emirati petroleum, all of it moves through this single geographic choke point. There is no alternative route that moves comparable volumes. When the strait is open and uncontested, it is invisible to most people. When it is closed, the entire global economy feels it within days. Iran has essentially shuttered the Strait of Hormuz, not by physically blocking it with ships, but through something more sophisticated and more legally ambiguous, by making it operationally dangerous. GPS jamming operations have created navigation chaos across the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. Maritime analytics firm Windward documented more than 1,100 vessels experiencing GPS and AIS interference within the first 24 hours of the February 28th strikes. By March 7th, that number had risen to over 1,650 ships. 55% more vessels losing navigation in under 2 weeks. At least 30 distinct jamming clusters were identified across the Persian Gulf region. Ship captains cannot trust their position data. Insurance rates for vessels transiting the Gulf have exploded to levels not seen in decades, because no Lloyd's of London underwriter is going to price the risk of a BeiDou guided missile the same way they price the risk of a GPS jammable drone. The risk profile has fundamentally changed. And right now, approximately 2,000 vessels and 20,000 seafarers are stranded in the Strait of Hormuz, unable to move, waiting for a situation that has no clear resolution timeline. What does that mean for oil prices? It means they are going up, and not slightly. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE have all reported Iranian attacks on energy sites following Israeli strikes on Iran's South Pars gas field. That was the escalation that moved this conflict from a military confrontation into a direct assault on the global energy infrastructure. The moment Iranian missiles started hitting Gulf energy facilities, the calculation for every commodity market in the world changed. Oil is not just an energy product. It is the base input cost for nearly everything manufactured or transported on the planet. Food, medicine, electronics, clothing. Every container on every ship that has been sitting unable to move in the Persian Gulf represents supply that is not reaching consumers. And the longer this continues, the more those prices rise. Stock markets have already begun pricing in the consequences. Chinese and Hong Kong stocks experienced their worst single day in nearly a year when the conflict escalated in late March. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer called an emergency meeting specifically focused on the economic fallout. Economist Steve Hanke warned that even US moves to ease Iranian oil sanctions, a tactical adjustment to try to reduce global demand pressure, could undermine the entire global sanctions regime that the West has spent decades constructing. The economic consequences of this conflict are not theoretical future risks. They are happening right now. And if the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed for another 2 to 4 weeks, mainstream economic analysts are warning of stagflation conditions that could affect every major economy on Earth. But here's what you need to understand about Iran's strategic calculus. And this is the open loop I promised you earlier. The part about what Iran is actually trying to achieve and why it matters enormously for how this ends. Iran's war aims, according to analyst Nagar Mortazavi, who spoke to Al Jazeera, are not to defeat the United States and Israel militarily. Nobody in Tehran thinks that is achievable. Iran's goal is to end this war on its own terms, to establish enough deterrence, enough demonstrated capability to cause unacceptable pain, that the conflict ends without Iran being forced into a humiliating capitulation. And the BeiDou guided missile accuracy is central to that strategy, because every missile that hits its target with precision is not just a military strike. It is a demonstration. It is Iran saying to Washington, to Tel Aviv, to Riyadh, to Abu Dhabi, look at what we can still do. Look at how accurate we are. You have killed our supreme leader, our defense minister, our intelligence chiefs, and we are still hitting targets, still precise, still dangerous. The Gulf states are receiving this message clearly. Kuwait is sounding air raid alarms multiple times in a single night. Saudi Arabia's eastern province, the heart of the kingdom's oil wealth, is being targeted by drones. Qatar, the UAE, and Bahrain are all facing Iranian strikes. And what is remarkable about the political response from these countries is not anger at Iran. It is fear. Gulf officials and civilians are not calling for escalation. They are calling for dialogue. Qatar's foreign ministry has said, diplomacy is the only path. Pakistan has offered to host negotiations. Egypt is involved in back-channel mediation. The Gulf states, which have some of the world's most sophisticated air defense systems and American military backing, are publicly begging for the shooting to stop. That tells you something profound about the psychological impact of Iranian missile accuracy in this conflict. Because when a missile can evade American and Israeli air defense systems combined and still hit a residential neighborhood in Tel Aviv, as happened according to Israeli authorities, the entire premise of air defense as a comprehensive shield starts to feel less certain. The Israeli military has publicly stated it has destroyed or disabled the majority of Iran's ballistic missile launchers. And yet, Iran continues to fire and continues to hit. And Israel has said it needs several more weeks of operations to complete its war goals. The logic of a few more weeks starts to sound different when those weeks include continued Iranian strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure, continued Strait of Hormuz disruption, and continued pressure on global oil markets. This brings us to China's role. And this is the dimension of this story that geopolitical analysts are calling the defining feature of the new multipolar world, and the thing that the current conflict is demonstrating in real time in a way that will be studied for decades. China is not a party to this conflict. China has not fired a single shot. Chinese soldiers are not on any battlefield in the Middle East. And yet China's technological fingerprints are all over the Iranian war effort in a way that is direct, documented, and strategically deliberate. Beyond BeiDou, China's state-owned defense electronics company CETC has been providing advanced chips and processors that improve the accuracy of Iranian ballistic missiles. These are the kinds of electronic components that the US has been trying to restrict through sanctions, and China has been routing around those restrictions through complex networks of subsidiary companies and front organizations. But the components kept flowing. And now those components are inside missiles that are hitting targets the CIA said Iranian missiles couldn't reach with this kind of precision. Here is the deeper strategic picture that China is executing. And when you see it clearly, it is genuinely sophisticated. China is watching the United States and Israel fight Iran. China is observing in live combat conditions exactly how U.S. fifth-generation fighter aircraft like the F-35 perform against Iranian air defense systems. China is watching how effective American electronic warfare is against BeiDou guided missiles. China is collecting real-world performance data on how well its own navigation system works against the most advanced Western jamming technology in a genuine shooting war. China is learning which of its radar systems Iran is using and how well they detect American stealth platforms. Every day this conflict continues, Beijing is getting more valuable military intelligence than it could generate from 10 years of exercises and simulations. And this is not speculation. Theo Nencini, a specialist in China-Iran relations at the China Med Project, said it directly. He said this war allows China to assess the effectiveness of its systems against American fifth-generation aircraft while collecting valuable data on the U.S. ability to intercept BeiDou guided missiles and drones. China is, in effect, running the most expensive and most realistic field test in military history, and it is not paying any of the costs. What China learns from this conflict will directly shape how it equips its own military, how it refines BeiDou's military tier signals, how it improves its missile guidance architectures, how it builds the electronic warfare systems it would use in any future confrontation over Taiwan or the South China Sea. The 2026 Iran conflict is, from Beijing's perspective, an intelligence and technology harvest of extraordinary value. And it cost China nothing but the political risk of being seen as Iran's technological patron, a risk Beijing is clearly comfortable accepting. Now, where does all of this lead? Where is this crisis heading? The diplomatic picture right now is extraordinarily fragile, and understanding it requires cutting through several layers of noise. The United States put forward a 15-point ceasefire proposal. Iran received it, and Iran described it through a high-ranking diplomatic source speaking to Al Jazeera as extremely maximalist and unreasonable. The source used language that was not diplomatic at all, describing the plan as deceptive and misleading in its presentation. Iran has made clear it knows what conditions it requires for a ceasefire and what it will reject. And Iran is demanding something that no Western media outlet is prominently covering: compensation. Iran is demanding financial compensation for the destruction caused by weeks of American and Israeli strikes on its territory. That demand alone tells you that Tehran is not in a posture of military surrender. It is in a posture of political negotiation from what it considers a position of demonstrated capability. Iran denied this and called Trump's claims an attempt to buy time while more U.S. forces deployed to the region. The White House press secretary has simultaneously called for peace and warned that if Iran does not accept the current military reality, it will be hit harder than it has ever been hit before. These two statements, "come to the table, but if you don't, we will destroy you," are not necessarily contradictory in American diplomatic strategy. They are a classic pressure campaign. But they are being deployed against a country that has already demonstrated it can absorb the loss of its supreme leader, its defense minister, and its intelligence chiefs, and still fire missiles that evade American air defense systems and land in Tel Aviv. Israel adds another layer of complexity. Israeli military officials have told American media outlets that they need several more weeks of operations to complete their war goals. Israel's UN ambassador has said plainly that Israeli military operations will continue until Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities are eliminated, regardless of any US-Iran talks. This creates a triangular tension at the heart of the international response. The US wants a deal, Israel wants more time to fight, Iran wants compensation and a ceasefire on its own terms. These three positions do not currently overlap. Meanwhile, the mediation architecture is remarkable in its geographic breadth. Pakistan has shared U.S. ceasefire demands with Iran. Egypt is involved in back-channel efforts. Oman is participating. Turkey is playing a role. Pakistan's prime minister has publicly offered to host in-person talks between Iranian and American officials as early as the end of March. China's top diplomat Wang Yi told his Iranian counterpart in a phone call that talking is always better than fighting, which, coming from the country that has been supplying BeiDou satellite access and electronic components to Iran's missile program, is a statement of breathtaking strategic irony. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov urged his Iranian counterpart to end hostilities. Even Russia, which has its own complicated relationship with Western pressure, appears to be genuinely concerned about the trajectory of this conflict. Lavrov specifically condemned U.S. and Israeli strikes near Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant as extremely dangerous. The phrase he used is the key one, extremely dangerous, because a strike near a functioning nuclear facility in a war that involves ballistic missiles and hypersonic weapons is not a controlled military operation. It is the beginning of a scenario that every nuclear-armed nation on Earth has been working to prevent since 1945. And this is the final point, the one I promised you at the beginning. The reason why this conflict, as terrible and consequential as it already is, carries within it a risk that is categorically different from any other regional war of the past 30 years. Iran has not confirmed whether it has achieved nuclear weapons capability. American and Israeli officials have spoken about destroying Iran's nuclear program as a war aim. But the 12-day war in June 2025 did not eliminate Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The current conflict has targeted it more extensively, but the architecture of a nuclear program, the knowledge, the centrifuge designs, the enriched material is not something you can bomb out of existence in a few weeks. And if Iran calculates at any point in this conflict that its conventional deterrent is no longer sufficient, that American and Israeli operations will not stop regardless of what Iran does conventionally, then the strategic logic that has kept nuclear weapons unused for 80 years begins to face a new kind of stress. Nobody in Washington, Tel Aviv, or Tehran wants that outcome. But the history of conflict escalation is not a history of rational actors always making rational choices under pressure. It is a history of miscalculation, of intelligence failures, like the intelligence failure that told the CIA Iranian missiles couldn't hit targets with this kind of precision, the same intelligence community that missed the full implications of the 2015 BeiDou memorandum, the same analytical frameworks that did not game out what would happen when Iran completed its transition to Chinese satellite navigation in June 2025. The world is being reshaped right now, not just militarily, economically, technologically, and geopolitically. The Strait of Hormuz blockade is not just a temporary disruption. It is a demonstration that a country with the right technology and the right satellite partner can threaten the global energy supply in ways that no air defense system can fully neutralize. The BeiDou integration is not just an Iranian capability upgrade. It is a signal to every country in the global south that there is now a credible alternative to US-controlled space infrastructure. And that technological sovereignty, does the ability to operate your systems without depending on infrastructure that Washington controls, is achievable and militarily significant. The 2026 Iran conflict is the first war in history where both BeiDou-guided precision weapons and AI-powered targeting systems were deployed simultaneously at operational scale by opposing forces in the same theater. What is being learned in this war, by China, by Iran, by every military planner watching from Moscow, Islamabad, Ankara, and Beijing, will define how the next conflict is fought, and the one after that. The CIA predicted Iranian missiles would be less accurate. They were wrong. China made sure of that. And the consequences of that single miscalculation, playing out across Gulf airports, oil terminals, naval choke points, and stock markets, are just beginning to reach the people, the economies, and the political systems that thought this was somebody else's problem. It is not. It never was.